So I've gone into a couple of these things with you earlier on the arcade, but let's go ahead and dig into a couple of what I believe are some simple but really powerful tools. And first of all, I've got this map. I'm going to go ahead and share it in the chat box if you want to go ahead and dig into it as well. And if this is a nice teachable moment, let's say this didn't work for you at some point. Now, I've shared this with the public, but you know how sometimes if someone shared something with you and they've got this organizational name at the beginning, what if you took off that organizational name, in my case, the Denver Regional Office, which is Denver RO, and you backed out that and you put www.arcgis.com and everything else is the same? What if you did that? Fascinating. Okay. So if I do that, then I'm going to see, oh, well, here's Joseph's web map. Here's the content. And look, he hasn't shared USA federal lands. No big deal. But everything else, okay, cool. And so if I go back into, I'm going to ditch a couple of these tabs, this one, and I say, oh, I'm going to share with everyone. Done. Okay. So that was just a little, if someone shares a map with you and you can't open it, try shaving off the organizational name and replacing it with just www.arcgis.com. All right, now I'm going back into the map. One of the things that I've added on here, and in this next section of the workshop, I'm sure you can relate as instructors, I'm not going to actually run every single tool in real time. And the reason why is because given bandwidth and so on, some of these tools take 10 seconds, 30 seconds to run. And I don't want to take time in the workshop to have you watch the processing going on. But I'm going to guide you through so that you'll say, oh, okay, I understand how that's done. So in this case, I want to show a couple of simple but powerful things. First of all, I've got a map note. So I just used add and add map note. Map notes, you might think, are the most basic thing, most basic element, and in many ways they are. You can add text, points, you can draw freehand, you can draw shapes, and so on, but they also can be used in analytical tools. So that's the reason why I'm including them in the workshop here. So on the map notes, okay, I'll illustrate that. I'm going to say, you know what? I'm going to run analysis. So this is where the 45 tools that I was mentioning earlier, remember these information buttons here that gives you a little bit of an indication of what you can do inside each one of these categories. And okay, that's good. Now, what I want to do though is I really want to, oh, look what I've got at my fingertips. I've got lots of things, but for this next section, I'm going to trace downstream. Now this is an illustration of why I think, well, just let me just have a moment. Okay, I'm good. The point is, the reason why I'm having a little geo moment is because some of you are aware of this. The way that these analytical tools used to work versus the way they work now is just a world of difference. They used to be like, oh, what's step one? You know, what data do I put for an input? And right? We'd have all these sort of memory devices that we would use to keep track of what goes first and what goes second. Now, all of these tools are wizard driven. So okay, step one, do this. Step two, do this. If you want to change step three, here are some options. You want to go on? Okay, step four. Good? Are you good to go? Do you want to make any modifications? If no, finish, run. That's the way these tools work. Now, that is absolutely a huge leap forward. And that's why we just wanted to have a geo moment with you. But in Trace Downstream, it's this classic, you know, dropping a cup of water on the landscape and where would it go? So many uses for it, teaching about watersheds and river systems and elevation and landforms and so on and so forth, where cities have grown and all that kind of stuff. Lots of different things you can do content-wise with this, but notice that the point features used as the starting locations. This is my illustration of, yeah, map notes are pretty simple, but they can actually be used in certain analytical tools like this one. So my point feature is my map notes. okay, that I'm going to use, and then I'm going to, okay, as an illustration of what I was saying earlier, okay, step 2, trace downstream. Do you want to split it? No, I don't want to split it. Maximum distance, I'm going to go 5,000 kilometers. Okay, I want to see where this water goes all the way down to the ocean. So I'm going to set it as a big, a large number. Do I want to clip output? In this case, no. I actually want to see where it ends up. And then my resulting layer name, and this is where I was talking about before. I highly encourage, folders and then meaningful names, because as you work forward in this environment, you don't want your students to do what one student here in Colorado did when I was looking over the student's shoulder. Okay, I'm going to call it Broncos because I'm in Colorado. Okay, and then the next layer was Broncos with 2 S's, and the next layer was Broncos with 3 S's. And after a short time, you know that what layer is what. I make it a point to do a couple of things when I do the layer. I give it a meaningful name. If I'm buffering it, for example, I indicate the size of the buffer, 500 meters, 3 miles, whatever it is, okay, on the buffer. So I indicate that so I know what I used. Another thing that I do is in labs or face-to-face for online courses, I encourage the students to put their names. If they're all in the same organization and they all have a layer called trace downstream, that's not so good. It will give you an error message if you're trying to save in the same organization with the same name. So, okay, give it your initials or some sort of unique identifier to you. So I do those things, and then remember the folders. So I've got folders here, and I can save my results in any of these folders that I have, for example, in ArcGIS Online. And here's that current map extent thing that I showed you earlier. So no, I don't want to use current map extent, right? I want to be able to see where this trace goes all the way down, and then I'm going to move these zoom settings around. And so, gosh, this is great. So once I do that, I'm not going to run it here, but once I do that, I'm going to get, as you would expect, a trace downstream. Now I can symbolize this however I want. So I've placed it right here inside a very nice place where I was hiking not too long ago. If I change the base map to topographic, you'll see that it was Reynolds Park. Okay, so where does that water go? It goes down this stream and eventually joins the South Platte, which rolls up through Denver, right? And it joins the North Platte and becomes the Platte. It goes into the Missouri and it flows into the Mississippi, and then all the way down to New Orleans, right into the Gulf of Mexico. So I've got this as now a couple of things. First of all, I ran the analytical tool, and the most powerful thing to me is that it is now a layer, right? It's a layer, okay? Which means that I can share it with you. You can use it. Ditto for any of these other analytical tools that create layers. They're like the Lego building blocks, right? The Lego bricks that create a bigger structure. So you can share the bricks and not just the map. You can share the layers and use the layers in your own further analysis. Wonderful to be able to do that. Another tool that is part of my simple but powerful, and you can run that, if those of you that are following along, go ahead and run that trace downstream. It doesn't take that long, might be 45 seconds or so. But sure, if I wanted to, I could have clipped it to just Colorado, right? All rivers flow out of Colorado. That's one reason why we appreciate the snowpack. We've got to have that snowpack and some summer thunderstorms to replenish our water supply, because everything flows out of our state. Anyway, the point is, I could clip it, but I couldn't clip it without a cookie cutter clippable layer, right? I'd have to have a polygon layer for, in this case, states or watersheds or something like that, okay? So, very nice. Now, here's another thing, folks, that I wanted to illustrate to you all, and that is another analytical tool in there is create watersheds, okay? Create watersheds. And I have run that create watersheds tool. It's a bit different from what you might expect, and so I wanted to go into what that looks like. In this case, first of all, you'll see that I've got two kinds of map notes. If I ran this create watersheds on this map note right here, I put the map note actually on one of the ridges that you can see the dotted line where the trail that I was at when I took a few wonderful photos of Pikes Peak. If we have time, I'll show you. But from here, the Watersheds tool, what it does is it says, okay, what's the water that's going to flow into this spot right here that I'm on right now? If I create watersheds on that tool, it would be very small because of the resolution of the digital elevation data that's using. And also because it's on top of a ridge. There is nothing that really flows into it. So again, being critical of the data, that little polygon that's generated from the point that's on top of the ridge, it's really almost meaningless. But what I did here is I created a new map note to this lower part of the valley. And then when I create watersheds, it gives me this. The watershed that flows into that spot is this one. Now, again, being critical of the data, what's one of the things you could do? You could add a layer that is a authoritative watershed layer, okay, that you trust. And one of the ones that I use is the Esri hydro layer, which actually has a watershed boundary layer in it. These dashed lines are the watershed boundaries. If I zoom out, I get bigger watersheds. As you can see here, I've got, for example, the South Platte watershed and the Arkansas and the Colorado and the Rio Grande, which is actually the ones that we have here in Colorado. You will have different ones. But the point is, I'm using another layer to verify. The point is, folks, that when you run in these analysis tools, they're so easy to just click, 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 click. You don't want your students to just say, okay, click, 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 and here's my result. Do you trust it? And what methods did you use? And what are parameters inside the analytical tools that you use? So it's another way of weaving in, when you verify against another source, what you're doing, okay? I'm really keen on that. Yeah, it's easier to make these maps and do these analyses than ever before, but pause, breathe, understand, make a hypothesis. What do you expect to see once you run this tool? All those kinds of things I encourage you and your students to do. Okay, so now I'm looking at the watershed that I created that flows into that blue spot that I've got right there, and it nests really nicely inside these bigger watersheds that I've got here. I can see that if I cross this particular ridge, I'd be in this North Turkey Creek watershed, which eventually flows into a different part of the Great Plains. Okay, so I'm verifying. Another thing that I can do is I can run, again, keeping in our core simple but powerful tools, I'm going to run a view shed. So create view shed, just like other ones. It's going to say, okay, where do you want the view shed to start? What terrain can I see from a certain point? Now, I usually teach this in conjunction with a short lesson. For example, siting a fire tower. You're working for cell phone company X, and they want to put a cell phone tower at a certain location that you can see a lot of the terrain. Lots of those kinds of applications. Those are the two I use most frequently, but you being the creative educators that you are, you can use your own. But the point is that inside that lesson, or inside your lesson, you can run this create view shed. And what that does, as you would expect, you can set the viewer height yourself, for example, or the height of the cell phone tower, the height of the radio tower, the height of the fire observation tower, or whatever it is, the tourist observation tower, or whatever it is you're siting. And also you can specify the distance up to a certain point. There are some limits on what amount of terrain you want to use. And you can see I'm practicing my own preaching here and saying, okay, I've labeled this or named this layer with a 30-mile label on it. And so from this point right here, which is actually this red sort of push pin, I'm seeing, oh, in this point, I can see a lot of the terrain to the south. I can't really see anything to the north of me, but a lot of area to the south, and these are the areas that I can actually see up to, I said, a limit of 30 miles. Okay. Another way to verify it, of course, is to use this measure tool. Okay, so in this case, I'm going to say, okay, I'm going to keep it in miles for this particular one. And so I'm going to say, 30 miles. So I'm going to band it out. Okay. Yeah, okay, so in a circle of 30 miles from that spot, these are the areas that I can see. And again, I usually teach it in conjunction with some sort of short problem-solving activity. Okay. The other thing that I wanted to do here with you all is as follows. I wanted to say, oh, remember the watersheds. Okay, so I have a watersheds layer that I just created, right? It's that blue polygon right there. And I've got a certain number of attributes in there. Not much, it's only got one feature in it, so it's got one row. Look, it's got where it came from. It's the 30-meter NED data in this case. And so it's 30 meter by 30 meter pixels, and this is the total area of it, and a couple of other things in here. Not much, but the power of this next tool, it cannot be overstated, and I will spare you with another geo moment of mine. But this to me is amazing because it takes advantage of the platform nature of modern GIS, what I call modern GIS, connected to the cloud. Okay, and that is enrichment. It's so important that it actually, if you go under enrichment, there's just one thing in there at the moment. that one thing is so powerful, it gets its own category. Okay, I'm seeing someone's got an issue with logging in, so I'll have a pause here in a moment after I run through the rest of these simple but powerful tools. Sorry about a couple of people having issues getting into this. Anyway, so data enrichment. I ran that, and I enriched my watersheds polygon. Okay, you saw what the table looked like earlier. I specified the data layers, the items, the elements that I wanted to be, sort of not the data layers, it's the attributes that I wanted to be added. So in this case, a couple of things I added, you'll see here in the table. Percent critical habitat, again, get into the metadata, find out what that is. Percent federal lands. So maybe I'm interested in planning a recreation area inside here somewhere. Is there any area that's already federal lands that maybe I couldn't have my own private, campground or something like that? Oh, super. Percent developed, according to the National Land Cover data. Okay, so we always have to say when we're teaching, right? According to this data set. I can't get that across more clearly than the following. Just keep saying, according to this data set, this is what we know. According to this data set, this is what we know and can deduce. It's always about, right, based on the data that you've got. So, according to this data set, we've got this amount of percent developed land, so not very much, right? This is out near the National Forest, as you'll see here in a moment. Obviously, I wouldn't be hiking around if it was someone's backyard. And percent at flood risk, less than 1%, that's good to, maybe that's part of my lesson as well. But I've added these things, and the way I've added them is in this data enrichment. So if I say enrich layer, I'm enriching my watersheds. And this is why I get so excited about this. Again, this is, I think, one of the best things that's ever happened to GIS in the last decade. I'm sincere about that. Select variables. Oh my goodness. It's almost like the Amazon experience. I mean, you're putting layers. In this case, I went to landscape. Gosh, show all landscape variables. Oh my goodness. I've added some things, as you see there. Mean slope. Look, as I add these things, they get put into this basket. So instead of you buying widgets on Amazon, you're putting variables into a basket. Even more exciting, I think. And again, understand, what all these are and where they came from. But again, powerful, and that's what I did to create this particular layer now. Now, again, being critical of the data, I said, okay, it says here, percent federal lands. Do I have a federal lands layer? I do, actually. And so I've actually got a couple of these, and I wanted to illustrate that to you in terms of the whole notion of being critical of the data. Now, according to this, it said this polygon had 15% federal lands. If I open two federal lands layers, you can see that there's all kinds of issues with land ownership, maybe where you are as well. It's not as straightforward as it may seem. So for example, this particular layer says administrative forest boundaries. okay, which actually doesn't include this polygon. But then if you look at federal lands, it's not quite the same as the forest boundaries. Forest Service being just one of many federal agencies, right? That you've got Park Service, you've got BLM, Bureau of Land Management, etc. But none of them actually cross this polygon. So at this point, I'm going to be very critical of that whole 15% federal lands in this polygon. Is it using a wider buffer? Maybe I need to look at the methodology a little bit more. The point is being critical of the data, okay? And this helps, okay, by adding those other layers in there. Another thing that I wanted to illustrate that's very simple and powerful is I can use that same map note. I'm going to go ahead and turn off the hydro, and I'm going to turn off my watershed. And I've got a map note here. I can buffer it. So I've got a 100-kilometer buffer here. Using the analytical tools, and I went to proximity and added the buffer. Okay? Now, I think a nice teachable moment is this particular map is in Web Mercator. So if you're closer to the poles, right, it is not going to look circular. It is going to look more of an oval, right? If I buffered, a place up in Nunavut, up in Canada, then we wouldn't see that circle. So projections matter. And you can, yes, load data in different projections into ArcGIS Online. So nice teachable moment there. But I've got a 100-kilometer buffer, again, being critical of the data. You use the measure tool, encourage your students to measure the, is it a diameter or is it a radius? What is the 100 kilometers? Then I've got a layer that I just added from the add button, and I've got operating commercial landfill. So let's say this is part of my, okay, I've got a water quality study, and I'm going to consider watersheds and river systems and landfills, aquifers, and so on. Okay, so I want to find out where these big landfills are. Okay, well, so I've buffered that, and now I say, ooh, I want to summarize within, which is another one of these analysis tools. It's summarize data and summarize within. Just like the other tools, it says, okay, well, what polygon do you want? And I'm just going to say, well, I want my 100-kilometer buffer, and you'll see this is where when I name things, it really, really does make things easier for me down the road. So here I've got my 100-kilometer buffer, and then I'm going to go on to, do I want any statistics? Do I want to group anything? What's my result? I'm going to count the number of landfills inside that buffer. Okay, so think of this as, okay, how many earthquakes are within, over the last 30 days, are within, 500 miles, 500 kilometers of your community? How many crime incidents have occurred within X distance of this certain intersection in town? I mean, there's all kinds of this kind of analysis that you can do, is basically summarize within. So let's go ahead and turn on the landfills. So you can see that data set. There's 55 landfills according to this data set. And when we summarize within the 100-kilometer buffer, we have count of points. We have 10 points inside, 10 landfills inside that 100-kilometer buffer. That is the most important piece of information. The buffer distance is right here, so you technically didn't need to label the layer with the 100 kilometers, but I always like to, again, to make life easier on myself down the road in my analysis workflow. So those are the things that I wanted to show in terms of here. With one more, and then we'll have a pause here. We've done many of these things, and we've done a couple of things that weren't even on this list. But I wanted to show you another really powerful thing that came in about a year ago, and that is a good illustration of the following. As time goes on, more and more of the tools that were traditionally only in desktop tools, ArcGIS Pro, for example, are migrating up to ArcGIS Online. Sometimes I get inquiries from educators that say, hey, Joseph, are we going to be able to have 1,100 tools inside ArcGIS Online at some point? Well, the workflows are different, so you don't really want to replicate every single one of those 1,100 tools in Pro. But as time goes on, sure, more and more of the things you're going to be able to do in the online environment. I mean, think of other things that you use nowadays. You know, the graphics editing software. right? There's a lot of online tools that are really quite good. The poster creation tools, you name it. All kinds of things that we can do with online cloud-based tools that we formerly did only on our own local device. Same thing with ArcGIS Online. There are still some very powerful things that you can do inside Pro that will be very difficult to replicate in the online environment. But as this decade goes on, as I'll talk more about tomorrow, this is a really exciting, viable option, especially now with educators grappling with, I've got to teach my whole environmental studies course online. What kind of online tools, GIS-wise, can I use in that environmental studies course, and so on. So I think it's even more relevant now than ever. But this is a good illustration of that. In the past, these particular tools that I'm going to illustrate, you could only do in ArcGIS Pro, and then before that in ArcMap. And so I've got some data in here. Let's go ahead and take a look at what I've got. I've got zebra mussels, so invasive species. I've got the zebra mussels mapped in this case by when they appeared. So light colors are before 1990, darker colors after 1993, and so on, okay? So, okay, that's great, Joseph, but what about these tools that you keep talking about? Okay, well, one of the things that I can do now in analysis is, look at this. I've got centroids, I've got best facilities, similar locations, existing locations. We've already done trace downstream and create watersheds. But over here, I also have, density, hotspots, outliers. We'll go into a few of those, time permitting, later on in the workshop. And then look at this. I've got buffers. I've already gone through one of those. The nearest tool I'll illustrate in the next activity. Tessellations. I'm going to touch on that too. But back up here, what I'm going to do is summarize center and dispersion. So I'm not going to touch on all of these, but the mean center, right? That whole classic balancing the set of points on a pencil, and where would that pencil point be? I think the most familiar illustration, apologies for people from international venues here, but you might have some for your own countries, but the center of population over time. So oftentimes we use this in geography courses and population studies, right, to look at, okay, 1790 census, it was centered, on the east coast of the U.S., and as migration internationally and also domestically happened, it's progressively moved west and south. So we've got the 2010, the 2020 could be in, probably still in Missouri somewhere, but anyway, fascinating to be able to look at this over time. So this is the kind of, where all of the people in the USA, according to the census data, I used to work at the Census Bureau, I love census data, I know many of you do as well. Imperfect, very useful, not perfect, but balancing that pencil point on the population of the country. Okay. That is an illustration. So I'm going to do that for the zebra mussels, and I'm going to do it over time to give me a better sense of the migration of these things. And also touching on the migration of these things, I think many of you know that a nice layer, a suitable layer to put on here would be rivers, because these things migrate in waterways, and also, as many of you know, the reason why there are boat checking stations, one of the primary reasons, is because a lot of times you've got a cavity of water in your boat, and there may be a zebra mussel in there, and then you're unwittingly transporting that to some other lake. You put your boat in the water, and then it spreads into that lake too. So humans have an influence on these creatures spreading, but also the migrating by water. So water is a good thing to have on here. I've done a trace downstream, as you saw earlier, but if I run the mean center, okay, and let's turn on the zebra mussels data. And in this case, the base map might be better if I used a different base map, maybe a light gray canvas, so I won't see so much of the underlying terrain or human-built features. The mean center before 1995. Okay, the mean center 1990. So this is, again, you can see, and I've labeled these, but how it's migrated a bit west. The mean center 2000 and after, interesting. So let's just turn on those two. And then I've got, in the same analytical tool, if you run this, if you're watching this video, for example, if you run that tool, you'll see one standard deviation around the 1995, remember the 1995 one, yep. And then the one standard deviation around the 2000, interesting. So it changes shape. This is, again, depending on the the level of your students, but it's a nice way of teaching a little bit of spatial stats because, okay, what's a standard deviation? What is one standard deviation above and below the mean? And here spatially, what shape is going to give me the one standard deviation of all of the points in my particular data set? In my case, it is a lot of points, but certainly nothing that ArcGIS Online can't handle. And we're going to get the table. I've got 1,753 zebra mussels points in this data set according to the USGS in this case. I used to work at USGS too, so I love USGS data, and I know many of you do as well. So that is the mean, center, and standard deviational ellipse. Again, think about other things that you could use this on. It doesn't have to be invasive species. It could be traffic counts. It could be incidences of litter on your campus. Whatever it happens to be, you can actually, earthquakes around the world, lots of things you can do here. So we've covered quite a few tools in this case, and those are the maps that I started with. Again, you can go in with your own account, open My Maps, and modify them and run those tools as well. Before we go on, I'm going to pause there and take a breath and make sure that you folks are not mowing the lawn or that everybody's still with me. I just think, folks, these are amazing times and amazing tools that we can actually tap into. So if there's no pressing, burning issues right now, I'm gonna move on to everybody. You know, make sure you stretch, and I do have a geography stretch video, which we won't show. We won't show right now, but if you're interested, okay, this is my geography stretch video, which you could run at some point if you really want to torture yourself. Okay, so there's me in my geography stretch video. All right, so let's move on after we've paused. And okay, good, thanks for the comments. Geography, spatial analysis, geographic analysis, you know, it didn't just get invented with GIS, right? There are certain incidences. There is a study in Paris in 1830-ish where someone was mapping cholera. There's also the famous John Snow cholera 1854 London map that many of you have seen in basically every geography textbook known to humankind over the past decades, because it is a famous case of the geographic inquiry process, having understanding a problem from the geographic perspective and then actually acting on it and removing the pump from the Broad Street pump, the handle from the Broad Street pump, and people's lives were saved. And so many of you have perhaps seen and maybe have taught this particular lesson, and I'm just going to run through a couple of these things. I'm going to go to the starting point and show you, okay, when you open this map, it's going to start with the John Snow map, which is a scan of the original and can't do anything with it, right? It is an image. It is a flat image. You can see the little black marks, sadly, where the cholera cases had occurred in that central part of Soho in London. So this is where you're going to start. And in here, we're going to, sorry about that, folks. I'm going to skip over to where we were. Should have opened that in a new tab. I'm sure you can relate. The results. Oh, I just did it again. No worries. The results I'm going to show here just in the interest of time. So what you do in this particular activity, and I've got this in GeoNet as a lesson, There are various forms of this lesson. One of them is actually in the Learn Lesson Gallery, I believe. One of them is in my own introductory GIS lesson inside GeoNet. You've got one or more cholera deaths. Okay. And now it's a point layer. So I've got it as a point layer there. I have you buffer the Broad Street pump in the lesson. I have you do a walk time, 2 minutes from the Broad Street pump. That is another analytical tool inside ArcGIS Online. Now, I'm not logged into this particular map right now. You can see the sign in over there. That's why I don't have the analytical tools at my fingertips at the moment, but that's what I did. That's a 2-minute walk time. Now, this is another moment where you can be critical of the data, because does that mean the walk time in 1854? No, it's modern walk time. And then you could ask the students to think about and have a little debate about whether it was faster to walk around, mid-19th century cities or faster now, and show them some drawings and some early photographs of the really congested nature of cities then and now. Then you're contesting with, horses and all of a twist and other people. And so you've got to be cautious of your surroundings, just like nowadays. You're watching for different things as you're walking along vehicles and so on. So the point is, this is a modern walk time with an old map. And then I have you buffer all of the pumps, okay? Then remember the summarize within. I have you summarize the deaths. And this is grim, but in today's issues with health and GIS, I think it's quite a pertinent, sadly, lesson to run. So in this case, I see that this particular polygon, this circle in the middle, this 500-foot buffer, is got 204 cholera cases within it, according to this data set. The second one was the 66, but 204 for that one. Then I have you run the nearest tool. And the lesson walks you through the consideration of people didn't always go to the nearest, just like today, right? Behavior. You may have a convenience store or a grocery store that's nearest to you, but you don't go to that one because of various issues, various reasons. Right-hand turns, preference, products. You may know someone that works there, all kinds of reasons. You don't go to the nearest one. And the same thing here. Okay. I have a couple of things like this, where you zoom to a particular place. You zoom out, you see that that is a ways out from the area that we were looking at. And so sadly, this particular individual liked the taste of the Broad Street pump. And so there's all kinds of things, not necessarily running the analysis tools, but get students thinking spatially and critically in here. Okay, so let's go back to our study area. The next thing that you do in this particular lesson is after you run the nearest command, is I have you route Dr. Snow to visit all of the pumps. And so this is the route. This is the only part of the lesson that's actually a bit fictitious, because his office was not actually at the intersection of Oxford and Tottenham Road. It was a ways away. But I said, okay, he's starting there on his route, and he's going to visit all the pumps. I also have you, and that's just with a route command inside ArcGIS Online. I also have you route yourself to all of the homes, all of the residents. Okay, and how long does that take you to do that? Can you do it in a day? People are dying. It's a critical situation. Can you visit all of the homes? Can you visit all of the pumps? Okay, so that is essentially the lesson. You're buffering, you're summarizing within, you're routing, and you're running the near command. That's in a walk time. So it's five tools, all run from the analysis tools. Yep, and you symbolize as well. Okay, I skipped that part. in the interest of time.